Hello, I'm Kristen Dailey, the Executive Director of Global Washington, and today I'm here with Dr. Eleanor Nwadinobi. Is that correct?
That's
Nwadinobi.
correct. Nwadinobi.
Thank you so much for being with us here today in Seattle. Eleanor practices medicine in Nigeria and the UK, and then after practicing medicine, it sounds like you had a new calling and decided to become an advocate for eliminating violence against women and children. You're here in Seattle and in the United States for the Commission on the Status of Women, correct, in New York?
And for the launch of the
That's what we'll get into.
Treaty.
The launch and yes, Eleanor.
Violence against women and girls.
Wonderful. Eleanor serves on a steering committee for the Every Woman Treaty, and Every Woman Treaty is actually a member of Global Washington. Mm-hmm. So another connection that we'll get to in a second. But your career has been amazing so far. And you've been elevated to a consultant and an advocate. You work with the United Nations, the World Bank, the African Union, and UNICEF, among others. So I feel very honored to have you here today and for you to share your story and your knowledge with us. So welcome.
Thank you, Kristen.
So yes, please tell us more about the Every Woman Treaty, this new launch. Tell us what the treaty is and how it works, and about the launch, please.
A treaty like no other to end violence against women and girls. Work has been going on, Kristen, for 5 years with over 1,700 women's rights advocates looking at how to put the wordings of the treaty together. And very recently, a public launch came to the fore. And what is this treaty all about? It's a treaty that is legally binding and will be catalyzed and backed by funding. This treaty is a call to nations to bring an end to the types of violence that are so multivaried. When you think of the fact that the current numbers regarding violence against women and girls is 1 in 3. And this is not worldwide.
Wow.
1 in 3 women, not including harmful traditional practices like female genital mutilation or widowhood, harmful widowhood practices. So we're looking at physical violence, we're looking at sexual violence, we're looking at emotional violence. And 1 in 3 women, when you look at it realistically, we're looking at about 1.3 billion women worldwide.
Wow. And you say it's legally binding, so right now, what's in place in certain countries to prevent this?
So what you do have some national laws, some of them legally binding, but what we are looking at is a global, not a national, not a regional, but a global treaties to which nations will sign up to, and there will be peer influence amongst them. Right. It'll be backed by dedicated funding, targeted specifically at violence against women and girls. And the interventions that are entrenched in this treaty are interventions that have been known to work. And these include legal reform. So we need the nations that will sign up to this treaty to ensure that they bring in the types of legal reform that will be effective, lasting, binding, to which they will be accountable. We also want to be sure that the responders to incidents of violence be they judges, doctors, nurses, police, or in communities where you have the first responders being, for example, community or traditional leaders, that they are appropriately trained.
Right.
So a situation where a victim or survivor of violence walks into a doctor's surgery and the doctor herself doesn't recognize it would be a challenge. So training for these responders. Then we want to provide services for the survivors. Services that are needed, for example, shelters, to take them out of the immediate challenge that they might be going through. We also want to make sure that there is violence prevention education for men and boys as well as for women and girls.
Right.
And all of this will need a dedicated pot of money.
Yeah.
So these are the interventions that have been known to work, and these are the interventions that the Every Woman Treaty will be following.
That's an amazing campaign. So something really bringing to light these issues of violence against women, and then holding countries accountable and providing the funding for the services.
Absolutely.
So I wish you all the luck with the campaign. I'm a strong supporter, so thank you for your work on that. The other thing I wanted to talk about today is Global Washington is really looking this month about the ending child marriage, again looking at the safety issues of women and young girls even. And so I'd love for you to tell us more about this topic in your work. What we know is that worldwide 650 million women and girls today were married before their 18th birthday, which is astounding to me to think about. So can you talk a little bit more about the risks that girls around the world are facing in early marriages?
Kristen, most of my work on early marriage has been in Nigeria, so I will be talking more about personal experience or personal work that I have done. And as a physician, to tell you that indeed early marriage brings about some of the most harrowing effects. So when you find that a girl who has been married early, when she gets pregnant, you have a situation where her pelvis is not adequately expanded or formed in order for her to have a baby normally. She faces issues around delayed labor. That delayed or obstructed labor affects not just her bladder, it affects her vagina, it may affect her rectum, because the head of the baby during labor presses on these organs, and she may end up with fistulae. It could be a vesico-vaginal fistula. Sorry that it's a very technical word, but that means that the young girl ends up leaking urine. And if it's a rectovaginal fistula, she ends up not being able to control the leaking of feces. And what usually happens in the communities where we have seen these young girls, and sadly, Kristen, these young girls who have been married early generally are married by much older men. So you could find a girl who is probably 12 being married by a man in his 60s. As soon as she has these problems where if she doesn't die during labor or her child doesn't die, when she survives and she's having any of these fistula issues, she's stigmatized by the very same man that married her early, by the extended family and by the community. And in that ostracized state, you then find her, not being, sometimes to even get a meal is a problem. And sadly, the very same areas where these practices happen are the areas where you have the large majority of the poor. That translates into lack of medical care, which further translates into lack of the availability of the specialized gynecologists who can perform the corrective surgery. And anybody who has done corrective surgery for fistula will tell you it's one of the most intricate surgeries to perform. And secondly, one of the most difficult areas to heal post-surgery. So you can imagine broadly, but that's just restricted to the health ramifications. Let's look at the social. A girl who is married early has her education truncated, and in Nigeria in particular, the northern areas where these practices are prevalent are the same areas where we have issues around the girl-child education. So girls are less likely to be educated in that area. This is made worse by her being married off early. And when she's married off early, if she was in school previously, that education is truncated. Or if she's married early, she's less likely to get to school. And because she then lacks education herself, she then is unable to provide knowledgeable or make knowledgeable decisions for her children and for her family. Around nutrition, around hygiene, and everything that education would provide. Again, the social issues around early marriage also include the fact that the girl is less likely to be able to exercise her human rights. So if she's in slave labor, or she's made to hawk on the street, she's less aware of if her rights are being infringed. So, indeed, the issues are enormous.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I haven't heard much about the medical conditions that stem from early marriage. And we do have several groups that work on fistula, and I think that makes sense. And even thinking about women who have fistula and the limitations on their ability to work. And as you said, if looking at impoverished areas and how that impacts the society and the economy, and it's just a cycle.
It
seems like early marriage can stem a lot of the potential of these young girls in education, in their own health, in the economy, and others. So what do we do about it? There's I know you've been involved in some advocacy, and thank you for localizing it in Nigeria, because I think this looks different in different countries and different regions, and it must have a different type of solution. So tell us more about your advocacy work around this as well.
Well, to answer your first question, Christine, what can we do about it? The Every Woman Treaty will be the answer to that. We know that the phases of that will take time to come on board, but the immediate interventions, such as we've been carrying out in Nigeria, include advocacy to religious and community leaders, because in communities of that nature, they are the custodians of these practices, so working closely with them. Another intervention that has had some success is getting religious leaders to come out with counter narratives of what some who are ignorant of the holy books would say. So working closely with what we call the imams and the religious scholars to say, what do the holy books actually say that are being misinterpreted. We've also been able to work with survivors themselves who speak up and speak out about what they've gone through as a way of dissuading those who might fall into it. Because when you think of it, sadly, in some cases you have mothers who will marry off their girls early as a source of income for the family. So it's really a multi-pronged approach. Having said that, that's at community level, and it's also important for us to work, just as I mentioned, how the treaty works, on legal reform. So permit me again to refer to Nigeria, where one of the things I was involved in was a violence against children study, because unless you have a study of the situation, only then will you know the enormity or the extent of what you're dealing with. And it was following that study that we discovered that in the northern part of the country we have as high as 76% of early marriage being practiced. Wow. So, that study I was on a technical working group for that study that brought the issues to the fore. We were able to get the president to sign a 1-year action plan. But you see, action plans are aspirational. They're not legally binding.
Is it with funding? Was there funding attached?
There wasn't funding attached, and that's why I keep coming back to our Every Woman Treaty to say, once you can get something, a treaty that's legally binding, that's mandatory for the government, that's backed by funding, you're more likely to achieve success. We also have the Child's Rights Act that is drawn down from the Child's Rights Convention that was passed in Nigeria, that we use the word domesticated, in 2003. But if you look at the map of Nigeria, you will see a very clear line as to those who have signed up to the law in the States are in the South, and in the North, where early marriage is practiced, we still have the states that haven't signed the law. Kristen, let me tell you about one case in particular, and this was with my last day job, where we had something that we call the Observatory on Violence Against Women and Girls. And what it was an online reporting platform in which the states in which we worked, we would record where violence happened. And there was a particular young girl of 14, Wasila, and she was obviously, she was married early. What was particularly awful about her case was that not only was her husband, constantly raping her, but he brought along 2 of his friends. Wasila, out of desperation, put a few drops of rat poison in their food one night. The 3 men in question, her husband and the 2 friends, died. And activists like ourselves, were up in arms when Wasila was arrested, and incarcerated, and being tried as an adult. And we worked very closely with the Federation of Women Lawyers, and to cut a very long story short, for a case that went on for several years, the first thing we were able to do was to say, but she's a child. What she did doesn't make things right, but she was driven to it. So eventually she was treated as the child that she was, and was released from prison. So, cases like that. Another quick story, about 8 years ago, we had a high-ranking senator in our National Assembly who divorced his 15-year-old wife to marry a 13-year-old newborn bride from Egypt. Again, advocates like ourselves, we got together, made a lot of noise about it. Unfortunately, in a predominantly male parliament, he got away with it. So I thought I would, these are well-known cases that you can read up in the public domain, just to show you the sorts of issues they're going through.
And you said you were part of a study to identify the problem. Do you know yet about the trends? I've heard even recently that the incidence of early child marriage has gone down in Asia, in Southeast Asia, but has gone up in Africa. And again, Africa is a large continent, but looking at different trends, or more importantly, are you hopeful for the future and making a difference?
We must always, always keep hope alive. And I won't apologize for going back to our Every Woman Treaty. For as long as we get our lead nations who will show and lead the way with that political will, I believe that the answer lies in the Every Woman Treaty.
That's wonderful. That's so great. Well, and we can put information on our website and through this video as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for all the advocacy and the work you're doing with Every Woman Treaty and on your own. So it is truly an inspiration. So thank you for watching us today. If you want to learn more about Every Woman Treaty and the work of Global Washington, you can go to globallaw.org. And thank you for watching.